everybody, welcome to Comic Tropes. I'm your host, Chris. I want to talk about a strange trend I discovered that happened in the late 80s, and that was where R-rated movies would all of a sudden be repurposed into cartoons, toys, and comic books for really young kids. All of a sudden we had Rambo, Robocop, Toxic Avenger, Police Academy. They were all turned into cartoons and comics. I remember toys for stuff like Alien, Predator, Terminator. All of this stuff was all of a sudden being adapted into kid-aimed entertainment, which was very far from its original adult, violent version. Okay, not Police Academy, but you get what I'm saying, right? So I was looking into the comics aspect of this. There were some Robocop comics by Marvel. They actually weren't too bad. I found Rambo. There was only one issue of this published by Blackthorne Publishing. And as I read it, I was like, you know what? This isn't quite indicative of what I was thinking, because this actually is sort of aimed a little bit more adult. The story behind Blackthorne ended up being more interesting. I'm going to review something, but I'm not going to review this comic. I'll explain why. So Blackthorne Publishing was formed around 86, and it lasted until about 89. A husband and wife pair had left Pacific Comics, an indie comics publisher that went out of business. It went defunct. They decided to form their own publishing company, Blackthorne. They did a lot of licensed comics and a lot of 3D comics. And for a while, they were actually doing pretty well. And then in '89, they went all in on a Michael Jackson Moonwalker 3D comic book. And it didn't sell. The company went under really, really fast. One of the final comics they published was Rambo. So when I found this, I took a look, and it was actually written by a guy named Ron Fortier. He's written for Marvel and DC a ton. He's actually done a lot of stuff, but he kind of did do slightly more of an adult comic with this. It's still a complete mess, and I will review it sometime, just not today, because it's not in fitting with that aiming it at young kids. Instead, what Ron tried to do was do a more authentic Rambo, really getting into the psychology of the character that David Morrell had tried to portray in the original novel, First Blood. The movies went in a more mainstream action direction than the book and what this comic tried to portray. But this came out in '89, and the movie studio was like, you know what? We don't want it to go into his psychology. We just want action, action, action. After Rambo 2 and Rambo 3 was just about to come out, that's what they were doing with the character. So this is just a jumble of action scenes. It's kind of a mess. It's bad in its own way. So I was like, okay, but you know, this is an interesting topic. What else could I look at? I could look at the comics of Robocop. I could look at, you know, other elements. And then I found the perfect thing to review for this week: a Rambo Christmas episode of his bizarre cartoon.
Rambo.
After Rambo First Blood Part 2, but before Rambo 3, there was a daily Rambo cartoon subtitled Force of Freedom. It was a bad choice. The Rambo films are hard R-rated action films with extreme violence. The cartoon was very much in the G.I. Joe mold. It took a character who was a tortured loner dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder, and it gave him two teammates to go on globe-trotting adventures with. Rambo in the films just wants to be left alone and to find some measure of peace. There's one thing he's very good at, being the ultimate soldier, but he doesn't want to do it. The cartoon had Rambo going on any old adventure he could come across and palling around with like-minded individuals. While it works for G.I. Joe, that show took it in a sci-fi spy versus spy type of direction. Rambo's cartoon has a tonal disconnect from the harsh material it's based on. And then they did a Christmas episode. The episode was written by Cheryl Scarborough, who wrote a lot of cartoons based on existing intellectual properties. Punky Brewster, Laser Tag, Mr. T, New Kids on the Block. She's kind of indicative of what the show was. Not bad, but kind of there just to cash in on something that interested kids in that moment. The title of the episode is When S.A.V.A.G.E. Stole Santa. I've done minimal research, so I don't know what S.A.V.A.G.E stands for, but they're basically like Cobra. They're interested in taking over the world, or at least starting wars, but they're also really small. The leader is a buffed up dude who looks like Hunter S. Thompson, called General Warhawk. I'm gonna guess he probably named himself. He has two henchmen, Havoc, who is strong, maybe? And Gripper, a dude with both an eye patch and a metal claw hand. Dude could have offered one of those traits to Havoc. Anyway, they sometimes also have extra henchmen soldiers as the plot dictates. The episode begins with Havoc and Gripper driving along through the Colorado mountains. At a certain point, General Warhawk taps on the glass. He's just sitting in the back like a granny and tells Havoc that he's excited to do something evil. It's a plate-setting scene that tells me nothing about these characters, but they have angry looks on their faces, so bad guys. Meanwhile, in a house somewhere, a bunch of kids are decorating for Christmas. There is zero adult supervision, so I guess they're orphans. I'm pretty sure it isn't explicitly stated, but the kids are a real United Colors of Benetton, so it's a reasonable guess. I also think the main kid's name was Tommy. He says Christmas is stupid. That's the starting point for one of the greatest character arcs ever committed to television. His friend offers him some candy canes, but I'll be damned if they don't look like a box of cigarettes. Not only does Tommy not take one, he kicks the box across the room. What a dick. Tommy further endears himself to us by wandering out into the woods in the middle of a huge snowstorm. He's not just a jerk, he's also very, very stupid. Fortunately for him, Rambo and his pal Turbo are taking a helicopter ride through the snowstorm for no reason at all. Rambo spots Tommy, and since he and Turbo are apparently not up to anything at all, aside from wasting gas and desperately trying to catch a cold, they head down to help him. Instead of landing, Rambo elects to take the most dangerous course of action. He hangs onto the skid and reaches down to pull Tommy up. Hanging onto the skid without sleeves is good enough for Rambo, so it's good enough for Tommy. Rambo doesn't actually rip his sleeves off. Instead, he puts Tommy on Turbo's lap. There's a fair amount of Tommy on adult laps in this episode, none of them Santa's. Rambo elects not to take Tommy home, and Turbo disappears to God knows where for the rest of the episode. Instead, Rambo visits Santa. Okay, it's not really Santa, but it's as close as they could go without actually putting him in, because I guess a second fictional character would be a bridge too far for a show with Rambo and Gripper. This guy is named Chris, no relation, and he makes kids' toys. He also dresses like Santa, but that's never really brought up. He explains to Tommy that Rambo once saved him. He used to manufacture bombs and he hated it, but Rambo got him out of that life. No specifics, that's up to your imagination. It just so happens that General Warhawk is in the same area to kidnap Chris and get him to make bombs. It's purely coincidence that Rambo happens to be there too. Warhawk has Gripper and Havoc go off to get Chris. I can already tell he'd have better luck entrusting such a job to any two local hobos he could wrestle up with the promise of cheap hooch. Havoc and Gripper immediately start shooting up Chris's shack. As far as a first step in kidnapping, it's pretty terrible. They're shooting actual bullets, so you gotta figure the chances of murdering your target are somewhat high. Gripper jumps through the smashed window, but Chris tosses a roller skate, which he times perfectly because Gripper steps on it and flips over, crashing on his back onto the table. What a stunt! Oh, and Rambo was using a dinner plate to potentially block machine gun fire. He's really lucky Chris threw that roller skate because there's no way that would have worked as a suitable defense. Then Havoc kicks in the door and starts swinging a sword. Rambo blocks it with the sack of kids' presents. They're immediately slashed to pieces. As if the battle wasn't awkward enough, Tommy decides to help. He runs up and just sort of hugs Havoc's butt. Surprising no one, this does nothing to hinder Havoc. In fact, he simply picks up the kid and runs away with him. I think he completely forgot that he was trying to kidnap Chris, not a random kid. Havoc just abandons Gripper and Chris and that whole mess and takes off with Tommy on a snowmobile. As you can see, General Warhawk has not hired the best in the business. Rambo hops onto another snowmobile. So is that Gripper's snowmobile? If so, how did they not hear them approaching? And no matter who left it there, don't leave your keys in the ignition. Okay, gotta let that slide. Rambo is in pursuit, but Havoc uses his sword to slow him down. He does this by basically just holding it straight up and cuts off tree branches like hot butter. Too bad for you, Rambo is an amazing driver and expertly avoids the obstacles. At a certain point, Rambo pulls alongside Havoc, but instead of Rambo reaching for Tommy, Havoc awkwardly reaches for Rambo. Is he going to kidnap Rambo too? It's all rendered moot when Havoc instead just drives down a different path. This guy is into improvising plans, and by that, I mean he does not ever follow a rational train of thought. Rambo jumps his snowmobile high into the sky and takes Tommy back. Havoc gets away. Rambo doesn't care, because he got some really sweet hair. Rambo and Tommy head back to Chris's cabin, and somewhere along the way, Rambo picks up a bow and arrow. Is this a continuity error, or did Rambo take the time to go shopping? Chris's cabin is in shambles, and Chris is gone. Oh yeah, that's because you totally left Gripper on the table. Maybe next time radio Turbo to come help, or tell Chris to go hide. What's interesting to think about is if this cabin is in shambles, if everything is just trashed, that means that Chris put up quite a struggle. So Gripper, a professional soldier of fortune, had a really difficult time taking down an old fat man. Rambo, with no clues at all, rushes to a sleigh with reindeer that happens to be outside. The bullets, snowmobiles, and fights have not scared them off. They're just hanging out in front of the cabin, waiting to give somebody a ride. Rambo hops in and doesn't notice that Tommy follows along and sits directly behind him. I'm not too impressed with Rambo's observational skills. We cut to a lumber mill that General Warhawk took over, or it was abandoned. But it still has power. Anyway, he's tied up Chris on a conveyor belt with a log-splitting saw at the end, and he tells Chris that he will help him make bombs. Chris glumly refuses. Gripper and Havoc have taken the time to get a biplane and a rocket launcher. I can believe that they have a rocket launcher, but where did they find a biplane? I think Cheryl Scarborough just wanted to see a biplane chase a sleigh, so it's happening. Their mission seems to be kill Rambo. Not sure how they found him, but they certainly have the upper hand. Gripper shoots a rocket which manages to explode between the sleigh and the reindeer. The explosion is small enough that it only destroys the reins, freeing the deer. And of course that is how a rocket launcher works. They're known for their very precise damage. Rambo and Tommy go flying down a mountain in the sleigh. Instead of jumping out, they ride it right off of a cliff. They're doomed, right? Nope. Apparently nothing can hurt them. They fall several stories and crash into the snow with not so much as a bruise. Rambo is starting to look superhuman, and I guess he's sort of supposed to on a cartoon. But when a little kid can keep up and do the same stuff, it's a lot less impressive. Rambo thinks fast and ties his knife to a rope. I'm sure a lot of us have pulled off a move like that when we're playing Dungeons and Dragons. Following this analogy, Rambo rolls a 20 because he throws the knife around the biplane like a grappling hook. That is a He-Man level throw. Gripper and Havoc conveniently look way to their right to see if Rambo died when he fell off a cliff. But Rambo cleverly climbs up the left side of the plane. Rambo is amazing. Gripper steps out onto the wing to fight hand to hand. He instantly loses his footing and is about to fall. Rambo reaches out to save him. The Rambo of the movies would have stabbed his knife into Gripper at this point. Gripper falls but lands in a lake full of logs and is A-OK. There is a certain height at which falling on snow or water doesn't save you, right? Like it would actually hurt. Because if cartoons have taught me anything, it's that you can fall from any height as long as you land on something with a little bit of give, you're fine. Havoc decides to make Rambo fall by flipping the plane in circles and generally performing like he's in an air show. And it works. Rambo, even with all his American muscles, can't hold on. He plummets from the plane. And when he hits the ground, he does not end up a crippled mess. He just slides down the hill. He looks like he's having a great time. Tommy sees Rambo sliding down the hill and jumps onto him, which stops his momentum. I think this might be where the writers of Fast and the Furious 6 got their idea on how physics work. Tommy hands Rambo a bow and arrow that he had. He just has it, and he gives it to Rambo. So if they've taken the time to establish that Rambo has his bow and arrow, that'll come into play, right? No, he never uses it. There's an abandoned shack that Rambo just deposits Tommy in and tells him that he needs to actually stay there this time. Rambo has learned his lesson. Tommy must be very carefully told exactly what to do. He doesn't leave Tommy with heat or a communication tool or anything though, so he's not quite at parental levels of responsibility yet. Baby steps. Rambo must guess that Chris is being held at the lumber mill because he goes straight there even though there haven't been any clues. Rambo then has some hilarious moves on the floating logs, jumping on them and rolling them to make Warhawk's soldiers fall into the water. No gunshots or arrows are fired. If you told me Rambo was having fun, I'd totally believe you. When Rambo gets to the edge of the lake beside the lumber mill, he finally encounters an actual threat. 2 soldiers shoot bullets at him, so he crawls up a completely exposed log chute. The soldiers throw a grenade at Rambo, which he punches. Yeah, he just punches the hell out of that grenade. It goes astray and blows up one of Warhawk's trucks. This spooks the 2 soldiers and they shout, "Let's get out of here!" What? Let's get out of here? The grenade, it should be noted, did not go back towards them. They have automatic weapons. Rambo has a bow and arrow. But they get the willies and run for it. Warhawk needs to examine his hiring policies. This is my favorite part. Rambo bursts into the mill and immediately gets into a fist fight with Havoc. In the scuffle, Rambo accidentally turns on the sawmill. Warhawk has apparently just been sitting around with Chris for hours, not using it. It's Rambo's fault that Chris is dragged towards his impending death. So who saves Chris? Warhawk! He turns off the saw and takes Chris and leaves. Way to go, Rambo. Chris and Havoc leave with Rambo trapped under some logs on the conveyor belt. Rambo is pulled towards the saw blade and pulls out his trusty knife. For a moment, I actually thought Rambo was going to cut the logs up. Instead, we get something that's nearly as ridiculous. Rambo flicks his wrist and the knife arcs through the air, severing a dangling power cord that controls the saw blade. No power means the blades stop just in time. Rambo steps outside and sees Warhawk and Havoc driving away with Chris. This causes him to finally get angry. He grits his teeth and shakes with rage. Uh-oh, now we're going to see the Rambo we all know. And we see a montage of him tying his shoelaces, holstering his knife, and tying on a headband. What's he going to do? He takes off his shirt and goes sledding. Yeah. He inexplicably sheds his shirt and jacket and pries off a hubcap, which he surfs down the hills. If they wanted to play some Beach Boys surfing music right about now, it would not be out of place. Rambo sleds up onto the roof of the truck and pulls Havoc out. It's sort of like Raiders of the Lost Ark, except Havoc just ends up in a snowdrift pouting. Rambo kicks Gripper in the face and easily knocks his gun out of his hand. General Warhawk is still hanging out in the back like a grandma. When he sees there's trouble, he doesn't bother trying to shoot Rambo, he calls for a helicopter. And he just grabs a rope and zips off to cause trouble another day. Rambo, for his part, just sort of leaves Gripper and Havoc by the roadside, free to kill another day. Rambo stops the truck and saves Chris. They're pals, so they engage in a manly handshake. Cut to Chris and Rambo dressed like Santa and obviously not Santa, but wearing Santa's clothes, visiting the probably an orphanage. Hey, Rambo saved Christmas, but what about Tommy? Rambo opens his gift sack to reveal he's been hauling Tommy around in there. Somehow still alive and stunned to be home, Tommy is welcomed back by his fellow orphans. Then Tommy asks to hand out some of Chris's presents. Rambo says that Christmas is for Tommy too and gives him a truck. Tommy says he likes the day now and that Christmas is contagious. Then everyone laughs like he's just told the best joke in the world. And by laughs, I mean the drawings shake like they're having seizures while voice actors laugh. Tommy, for his part, looks as confused as the audience must be. The perfect ending to the perfect Christmas miracle. Okay, hope you enjoyed this slightly different episode where I looked at a cartoon instead of a comic book. I hope you'll forgive me, but it just was so crazy. I had to do it for Christmas time. I was blown away by how bonkers this thing was. I appreciate all of your support. Videos are getting watched. People are joining my Patreon. I really appreciate it. Have a good holiday, and I'll see you next week. So until then, keep reading comics.